Hello everyone, welcome to another installment of Variants I Hate Fighting! In this video, I'll be discussing one of the most annoying fighters to deal with, at least in my opinion. You know her. If you're like me, you probably hate her. The one, the only, Corrosive Agent! So let's go ahead and start off by reading her signature ability, Poison Chalice. Keep in mind that this is going to be her ability at its fullest potential. Remove all debuffs and gain 3 stacks of barrier when either fighter uses a Blockbuster. With 5 stacks of barrier, all shots are unblockable and inflict slime on hit for 10 seconds. So everything about her first ability is awful. Not only does she gain 3 stacks of barrier every time someone uses a Blockbuster, but she also removes every single one of her debuffs that you've inflicted on her. This can make her extremely tanky if you're not careful, and even if you are careful not to use any Blockbusters, she can trigger her own ability using a Blockbuster. So either way, she might be a pain to take down. And the longer she survives, the more likely it is she's going to fill up her Blockbuster meter on her tier 3 Blockbuster, which I'm going to go ahead and assume she has. And naturally, when that gets filled up, well, you really have to hope she doesn't use it. Her second ability is less notable, to the point where I actually kind of forgot it was a thing until reading about it again. It's one of those things that you don't really have to worry about like the first one. Next, let's go ahead and talk about her Marquee ability options. Keep in mind, these options are going to be at their fullest potential. First, let's go ahead and start with Metal Breakdown. So, Metal Breakdown. Special shots inflict 30% bonus damage and inflict armor break for 10 seconds. Also applies on blocked hits. Next is No Time to Die. 50% chance when the opponent lands a critical hit to gain regen and haste for 10 seconds each. So I'm not even going to talk about Metal Breakdown because if you fight a Black Dahlia with Metal Breakdown, she's going to be 100 times easier than fighting a Black Dahlia with No Time to Die. So let's go ahead and discuss No Time to Die. Now, No Time to Die can be incredibly annoying because it can give regen to Corrosive Agent as well as haste. So not only is she able to heal a lot of the damage that you're able to dish out, but haste makes it so her Blockbusters fill up even faster. And considering using a Blockbuster is what activates her signature ability, that is absolutely not what you want to see. Although one thing to note is her ability did get nerfed recently, so it's not quite as bad as it used to be, but it still can be kind of a pain. Now, I'm not going to bother talking about her other Marquee ability or her Prestige ability, because both of those abilities are offensive-oriented, and they are not what makes Corrosive Agent scary. So instead, let's go ahead and talk about some helpful debuffs that I personally think are specifically good against Corrosive Agent. Keep in mind, by the way, that these debuffs are not listed in any particular order, so let's go ahead and start off with Hex. Hex is probably one of the best debuffs to inflict on Corrosive Agent because when a character is inflicted with Hex, their signature abilities are disabled, meaning that if Corrosive Agent has Hex, even if you or her use a Blockbuster, her debuffs are not going to be removed and she's not going to gain stacks of barrier. And with that restriction out of the way, you're pretty much free to use Blockbusters whenever you want. Of course, even if Corrosive Agent is inflicted with Hex, her Marquee ability can still activate, meaning you may still have to deal with regen and haste. So keep that in mind. Now, every other debuff that I'm about to talk about can easily be removed by Corrosive Agent's ability, so keep that in mind. Unless, of course, she has Hex. But before we get into talking about more debuffs, there is one important thing that I want to note. Corrosive Agent cannot remove permanent debuffs. So a permanent debuff, like the name would suggest, is a debuff that cannot be removed. They also don't have timers. Not to get them confused with timeless debuffs, which also don't have timers. Permanent debuffs have a special border around them that indicate that they're permanent and they cannot be removed. Timeless debuffs look like pretty much any other debuff, it's just that they don't have a timer, but they can still be removed. Now, with that distinction out of the way, the next debuff that I want to talk about is Inverse Polarity. A character inflicted with Inverse Polarity has their healing reversed, meaning that if they were to recover health somehow, some way, if they have Inverse Polarity on them, instead of recovering health, they would actually lose health. In Corrosive Agent's case, assuming she has No Time to Die, you can very easily turn her regen against her. Now, if Corrosive Agent doesn't have the No Time to Die Marquee ability, then this debuff is going to be, well, completely useless against her for the most part. Also, the usefulness of this debuff kind of decreased with the nerf of No Time to Die, but it can still be useful. Another debuff that can help deal with regen is Heal Block, which, as its name would suggest, prevents healing from all sources. Not quite as helpful as inverse polarity, but still really useful. Next, let's talk about curse. So whenever a character is inflicted with curse, they are unable to gain any buffs from any source. Naturally, this means that if Corrosive Agent is inflicted with curse, she's not going to be able to gain regen or haste from No Time to Die. Unfortunately, curse doesn't do anything to stop her signature ability from activating, so she is still going to gain stacks of barrier once she activates her signature ability, and she's going to remove curse as well, obviously. Another debuff that I think is kind of worth noting is slime. So whenever a character is inflicted with slime, they lose 2% of their max health every time they gain a buff per stack of slime. So while I don't think it would make a big difference, if you can inflict slime on Corrosive Agent, once she gains regen from No Time to Die, she is going to take a bit of damage depending on how many stacks of slime that she actually has. Once again, maybe not the most useful debuff on its own, but it's not like it hurts to have. Next, I want to talk about bleed. So characters inflicted with bleed lose 1% of their max health every second for each stack of bleed that they have. One awesome thing about bleed is that when you actually inflict bleed on somebody, they lose every stack of regen that they have, assuming it's not permanent. This also works in reverse, however, so if you were to have, let's say, 5 stacks of bleed on Corrosive Agent, as soon as she gained a stack of regen, it would remove all stacks of bleed. So once again, not the most useful thing, but it could be helpful when getting rid of Corrosive Agent's regen. Then there's Disable Blockbusters, which, as the name would suggest, makes it so a character cannot use Blockbusters. Obviously, this is helpful since Corrosive Agent needs to use a Blockbuster in order to activate her ability. Slow can decrease meter gain rate by 50% per stack of slow, and it could also remove haste. So once again, another debuff that is good specifically with dealing with Corrosive Agent's use of Blockbusters to activate her signature ability. And the final debuff I want to talk about is Wither. A character inflicted with Wither loses 5% of their Blockbuster meter per second per stack of Wither. Like the 2 previous debuffs I just talked about, it can help limit the amount of Blockbusters that Corrosive Agent is actually able to pull out. Now, those are the only debuffs that I really wanted to take note of, but obviously any debuff that you conflict on Corrosive Agent is going to be helpful in some way, and if you could combine all of these debuffs, then that'd be even better. I don't really have any buffs that I want to talk about that have a specific use against Corrosive Agent specifically, so instead I'm going to talk about a few different strategies you can try against Corrosive Agent. So first off, when you're fighting Corrosive Agent, obviously you're going to want to try to avoid using Blockbusters, assuming you don't have a way to inflict Hex. So putting together a moveset that focuses more on special moves can be a way to avoid activating her signature ability while also dealing decent damage. One character in particular that I think works well with this kind of strategy is Beowulf. If you use Beowulf, you can spam Wolf Shoot, which is basically just a throw attack, and you avoid using Blockbusters, therefore preventing her from activating her signature ability. But on top of that, you also avoid accidentally activating No Time to Die, since throws cannot crit. His chair move would also be pretty decent, I'd say, just because it can do some decent damage while hitting only one time, therefore making it extremely unlikely you will activate Corrosive Agent's No Time to Die ability. But I'm not much of a Beowulf player, so you guys would have to tell me if that's correct or not. Next is buff removal / buff stealing. If you have a character that can steal or remove buffs, you should be able to get rid of Corrosive Agent's barrier, assuming you or her trigger it, reducing her tankiness. On top of that, you can also remove her stacks of regen and haste from her, assuming she has No Time to Die. The only caveat, in my opinion at least, is the frequency in which you can actually steal / remove buffs. If you can't steal them or get rid of them quick enough, then it's possible that Corrosive Agent is going to be able to heal a decent amount of health from her stacks of regen. And if you can't out damage her healing, then obviously that's going to be a huge issue. Another strategy you can try is to use a Critless Build character. So what a Critless Build character is basically a character that has as low critical hit rate as possible, the lowest being 5%. To achieve a Critless Build, you have to pretty much unlock every single skill node of a character except for the critical hit rate nodes, since the idea of a Critless Build is to have as low crit rate as possible. And obviously, when it comes to moves, avoid critical hit rate increasers. Using a Critless Build against Corrosive Agent, assuming once again that she has No Time to Die, will help you avoid getting critical hits and therefore avoid activating that ability and preventing her from getting regen and haste. One last trick I want to talk about before getting into specific variants that I like to use against Corrosive Agent. If you are fighting a team with Corrosive Agent on it, but Corrosive Agent isn't actually out yet, one thing you can do is use your level 3 Blockbuster right before she's about to come out. So when I say that, I mean right before her portrait is up on screen. Because if her portrait is up on screen, this isn't going to work. But if you can pull that off using a level 3 Blockbuster before her portrait comes on, you are going to get a level 3 Blockbuster on her without her signature ability activating. So if you time it right, you can get a lot of damage in on Corrosive Agent without even triggering her ability. So that is something to keep in mind. Now let's go ahead and get into the specific variants that I like to use against Corrosive Agent. Starting with, I feel like maybe the most well-known character that's good against Corrosive Agent, Nunsense Double. So let's go ahead and start off by reading her signature ability, Counterfeit. Keep in mind once again that this is at its fullest potential. When at an elemental advantage, gain 3 random buffs for 10 seconds anytime the opponent gains a buff. When at an elemental advantage, inflict 3 random debuffs for 10 seconds after suffering any debuff. And since this ties into what makes her so awesome, we're going to go ahead and read Nunsense's Marquee abilities, although only one of them I am going to recommend using. So let's go ahead and start. Chaos. When at an elemental advantage, inflict a random debuff for 15 seconds when landing a critical hit. Volatility. Every 10 seconds, gain a random buff for 10 seconds. Now, I do recommend picking Chaos as Nunsense's Marquee ability, since it'll help you when inflicting debuffs, and that's kind of what you're trying to do when using Nunsense. At least that's what I try to do. But let's go ahead and backtrack to talking about Nunsense's signature ability. So what makes Nunsense so awesome is that she is easily able to gain a ton of buffs, especially against Corrosive Agent, since whenever Corrosive Agent gains a buff, Nunsense gains even more buffs. And since Corrosive Agent gives herself 3 stacks of barrier whenever you use a Blockbuster, well, yeah, you're going to get a lot of buffs when using Nunsense. As for debuffs, because Double just naturally has moves that inflict debuffs anyway, on top of having Chaos as a Marquee ability, it's just very easy to inflict lots of debuffs on Corrosive Agent. And because of all of these different factors, Nunsense just has a lot of damage potential against water elemental characters specifically. So obviously against Corrosive Agent, she's going to do very well. One thing to watch out for though is Double's transmutation ability. If you block for too long, Nunsense is going to switch elements from wind to some random other element, and she needs to be at an elemental advantage in order for her signature ability to actually activate. If you do accidentally switch elements, one thing you can do is tag out and then tag back in, and Nunsense will be back to her base wind element. This particular strategy of using Nunsense against Corrosive Agent is definitely the most accessible, I'd say, than any other character I'm going to talk about, just because Nunsense is a very easy character to get since she's a bronze character. But with that being said, because she's a bronze character, her stats are just going to naturally be lower, even as a diamond, than other characters. So just be careful with that, because without all of those buffs protecting her, Nunsense is very squishy. The next variant that I'm going to talk about is Mean One Peacock. So let's go ahead and start by reading her ability. Holiday Jeers. Gain Enrage for 15 seconds for every buff gained by the opponent. Projectiles have a 50% chance on hit to convert one opponent buff into a random debuff. What makes Mean One so awesome is that she can convert Corrosive Agent's buffs into debuffs, and since Corrosive Agent gives herself buffs without timers, aka her barrier, whenever Mean One turns that stack of barrier into a debuff, it also is timeless. On top of that, because Corrosive Agent gains so many buffs so quickly, it is very easy for Mean One to get tons of stacks of Enrage, which of course will give Mean One a huge damage increase. Now when it comes to my Mean One, she has a lot of critical based stuff, which would be something typically you would want to avoid against a Corrosive Agent just because of no time to die. However, in the case of Mean One, because she can turn regen into debuffs, it actually doesn't really hurt her all that much to have crit rate stuff, because triggering no time to die gives you even more potential to inflict more debuffs on Corrosive Agent, but that's just the way I like to do things. Unfortunately, because Mean One is at an elemental disadvantage, her damage is actually decreased, and on top of that, she also takes more damage from Corrosive Agent attacks, so that's one thing to keep in mind if you're going to use Mean One. The next character I want to talk about is Death Wish, which is actually a variant that I only started really using recently, so let's go ahead and read her signature ability, Voracious Cycle. Every 7th combo hit landed on Umbrella or the opponent transfers up to 3 enemy buffs to herself and inflicts Hex for 10 seconds. Once per match when defeated, resurrect with 25% health and revive all defeated teammates with 25% health. So Death Wish is kind of a cheat code against every variant in the game just because she can inflict Hex and steel buffs, making her an extremely ridiculous threat. And in Corrosive Agent's case, because she can inflict Hex, obviously she can prevent Corrosive Agent from gaining any buffs from her signature ability, but even if you did trigger her signature ability, you can just steal her stacks of barrier by getting a 7-hit combo. And on top of that, you can also steal her regen and haste from No Time to Die. The only issue I've had with using Death Wish is my Death Wish's damage output isn't the best. So while I can do a lot of stuff against Corrosive Agent, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be able to take her down within the time limit if you include the other two fighters into the equation. But that's more related to my own stats on Death Wish, and that can easily be amended by just leveling up her moves or rerolling stats. Now, the final variant that I want to talk about is a variant that I really don't even use anymore against Corrosive Agent just because I have so many better options. But I'll talk about her anyway because I used to use her a lot. That variant is Psykid. So naturally, let's go ahead and start off by reading her signature ability, Mind Over Matter. When hitting an opponent, gain Deadeye and inflict inverse polarity for 15 seconds each. 100% chance to reset the timers of all Umbrella's buffs and all opponents' debuffs except Stun and Doom when the opponent bounces off a wall. So my main strategy with Psykid was to inflict inverse polarity on Corrosive Agent and then just give her a beatdown and try to maintain inverse polarity as much as I possibly can without using any blockbusters. And by doing this, my main hope was that whenever Corrosive Agent would gain regen from No Time to Die, her regen would actually just take off lots of her health because of inverse polarity, and hopefully I would be able to just defeat her. Now, the main issue with this strategy is if you can't actually inflict inverse polarity on Corrosive Agent, then using Psykid against her is not really the best idea because that inverse polarity is, at least in my opinion, the thing that really makes it so Psykid is actually able to defeat Corrosive Agent, at least more easily. But I guess technically speaking, you could, in theory, inflict Hex on Corrosive Agent first, and then switch to Psykid, and then just maintain Hex on her. That would be a nice way to do things. That's not really the way I did it before, so yeah. Anyways, that was just my strategy with Psykid. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend using her. But yeah, those are all the tips that I have for dealing with Corrosive Agent. I still haven't gotten into guest stars at all, so I can't really say whether or not there is a specific guest star out there that would have a very good use against Corrosive Agent specifically. I know there's one Brain Drain one that makes it so the enemy can't use any moves while it's out. So I guess I would recommend that one maybe, but like I said, I really don't know much about guest stars, so you guys are gonna have to tell me about that. Hopefully you guys found these strategies and tips useful. Let me know what different strategies you guys use against Corrosive Agent, and let me know also what variants that you guys like to use against Corrosive Agent, especially if they weren't featured in this video, because I'm super curious how you guys deal with this monster. Also, I do want to apologize. I'm sorry that it took me so long to do another one of these variants that I hate fighting videos. I actually do like doing them. They just take a little bit more effort, I guess, than my regular videos. But let me know if you guys want to see any more of these, and if you do, let me know who specifically you want me to talk about. Although, keep in mind, there are some fighters that I really don't have a good strategy against, but I'll still try. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye!